Hello and welcome to the Falmouth Chamber of Commerce Business Education Series on affordable housing. I'm Michael Kasparian, President of the Falmouth Chamber of Commerce. I'd like to take this opportunity to thank FCTV and the Cooperative Bank of Cape Cod for supporting and sponsoring this important initiative to bring to you, the public of Falmouth, the issues and the challenges facing us today with affordable housing. I'm really pleased to be joined today with some experts and people, stakeholders in Falmouth who are affected by this issue each and every day. And our first session today is going to be talking about affordable housing, why you should care. I'm pleased to say I'm joined today by Dr. Michael Goodman. He's a senior advisor to the Chancellor for Economic Development and Strategic Initiatives at UMass Dartmouth. He's also a professor of public policy. Thank you for joining us.
Pleasure to be here.
Michelle Scarbeck, who is the Vice President of Human Resources of Cape Cod Healthcare. Thank you for being here.
Thank you.
Obviously a huge stakeholder with the largest employer, I believe, on Cape Cod.
That's
and
correct.
I believe the largest employer in Falmouth.
Correct, I believe so too, yes.
So, Dr. Sonia Tellier, our Assistant Superintendent of Falmouth Public Schools.
Good morning and thank you.
You're welcome. You've been in Falmouth a long time.
21 years.
21 years, so you've seen a lot of changes. It'll be great. Wonderful.
Great, thank you.
And Wayne Lingefelter, the Executive Director of the Falmouth Economic Development and Industrial Corporation. Wayne, thank you for being here.
Certainly, Michael. Thank you for having me.
I'd like to start today by asking Dr. Goodman to give us an overview of affordable housing, talk about big picture, and then kind of bring it down so we have an understanding of how this is really affecting a small town like Falmouth. Michael?
Sure, I'll take a shot at it, Michael. So affordable housing is a critically important issue both here in Falmouth and across Massachusetts, and has been a long-standing challenge. Obviously, housing and shelter is a fundamental human need, but it also plays a role in the economic competitiveness and cultural and social vitality of a community. You need to have enough housing units to accommodate your residents, to accommodate your workers, and to have a vital community environment where there are enough people at different ages who can fill the necessary positions, lead in various community roles, and create the kind of dynamic community that I think we've all come to expect, and we certainly need. Massachusetts, more broadly, has not kept pace in terms of its production of housing units with the growth in our population for a number of decades now. And so this has been a very large-scale problem that leaders in Boston on Beacon Hill and the governor's office have been focused on considerably. Here on Cape Cod, it's a particularly acute issue because you're facing some constraints. Available land is limited. Available land that can be developed for environmental or due to infrastructure constraints is limited too. So it has made that problem all the worse. Over the last few decades on Cape Cod, we've seen the population age, and the inadequate supply of housing has made it difficult for the next generation of families and workers to make a life for themselves here on Cape Cod. And in recent years, you've started to begin to pay the price for that with labor shortages and declining enrollment in local public schools, and then I think a more stark divide within the community between folks who are well beyond the child rearing age and those who are trying to find a way to make it here on Cape Cod. Cape Cod is a beautiful place. It's very appealing, and I think it's very attractive for that reason. But in the absence of the housing that is required to support families, residents of different ages, school-age children, and particularly working-age adults, I think there's a whole lot at stake here for this community and for Massachusetts, and I think a real urgent need to address this inadequate supply of housing.
Very well put, thank you. I know one of the statistics that we talk about is that we have 32,000 full-time residents here in Falmouth, of which 45% are senior citizens. So kind of back to that equilibrium you're talking about, we have an older population, and some of the statistics show that there's going to be a zero net gain in population in Falmouth, about 32,000 people by the year 2030, except that number of senior citizens is going to rise to 60%. So when that happens, we lose equilibrium, and of course, the services that the aging population need go up, and the folks that are available to provide those services. So I think it's time that Michelle is here, talk a little bit about Cape Cod Healthcare. We're blessed to have one of the hospitals on Cape Cod in town. And
Yes.
how is this affecting giving care to the community?
Well, this has been challenging, coupled the issues along with what happened with the pandemic. We have over 450 open positions. Right now, we have approximately 4,900 employees. Over 800 of those are at Falmouth. So, we're constantly sourcing and looking for ways to be attractive to candidates to kind of give some incentive to come down here. But once we get people down here, they can't find affordable housing. And yes, we do lose candidates because of that.
Now, is that true also for top-level positions, doctors, as well as middle and
It can,
service providers?
yes. Yep, it can be.
So the problem is that acute, it's that problematic.
It is, yes. So not just affordable housing, but housing in general. And the other piece with the healthcare system is that we rely on summer help as well, like many industries on Cape Cod. And that summer help needs short-term rentals for the summer, and affordable rentals are few and far between. So that's another conundrum for us, is how do we overcome that? We reach out to actually staff members to see if they have a room for rent. We try every option we can to be able to staff appropriately for the season.
And the one thing I know Cape Cod Healthcare has been doing is opening up new urgent care centers and trying
Correct.
to provide more services in more locations.
Correct.
Of course, that's going to be impacted even more severely by not having people to man those facilities.
Yes, yes. And we've been fortunate enough to find people to staff those facilities fully as we need them. But, it's getting more and more challenging as time goes on.
Yeah, we were having a conversation before we came in here, and I think it was the Boston Globe that was talking about there was on Cape Cod 40-something houses, only 40-something houses for sale right now today under $1 million on Cape Cod in Barnstable County. So if that's not an issue, I don't know what is. And on the other side of that equation, Dr. Tellier, if you could talk to us a little bit about the school population, what it's like trying to keep teachers, hire teachers, and then of course with families moving out, how does that affect your overall view in the future for the schools?
Sure. Thank you, Michael. I found that as Michelle was talking, I wanted to echo many of the points from the employment perspective. But then it compounds for us. It becomes another prong. If we're keeping staff here, we're also looking for families to begin here so that the students are enrolling in our public schools. And so when you're looking at the combination of providing housing opportunities for new professionals to enter our community and then have them persist with us and establish the families and be part of our community, it kind of goes through those two different channels. And then as we're thinking through it and we look at the fact that the current workforce in the Falmouth Public Schools is largely a veteran workforce. So over the next few years, it compounds again as we're looking to have those positions that are vacated through retirement refilled. And as we're going through that, we're starting to encounter conversations where we're offering employment. And then as people are looking and deciding whether or not to stay with us, they're evaluating, can I find housing? And we've had instances where people have declined opportunities. So that then goes back to affecting the quality of the education, right? If you're concerned about bringing in candidates who want to stay and persist with you and be part of that. And then along the way, in thinking about the conversation, as you alluded to, that we were having before we came in, I think there's a real common conversation around what it means to be college and career ready. And I think that if you think about college career, you also need to think about being community ready. And so one of the vehicles that we've used to really bring that conversation forward and have our students see themselves staying in Falmouth is our partnership with the Woods Hole Research and Scientific Community and the Greater Professionals of Falmouth, and really diving deep in and looking at, beyond the scientists and the researchers, what are all of the roles that make that community what it is, and just helping our students see themselves as members of our community moving forward. But just in looking at that and then building out some of our career vocational, technical educational programming, helping our students see themselves, but then it's competing with the pricing and the market and the conversation we're having today.
So how about the pandemic? Has that increased people retiring? Is that causing more of an issue of people? You said you have a veteran population of teachers. Are you seeing more teachers maybe because of the pandemic and the pressure that has come along with that, maybe looking to vacate? And does that put more pressure on you to hire new teachers?
I think there's more conversation, but I think it's also tied to a national conversation. I think it's a little bit bigger. But then, it comes back in the conversation we're having today, and people looking in the longer term, being able to stay where they are, and what does that situation create for them. So I think we hear that conversation, and certainly the pandemic brings it up for any number of reasons for anyone, but we don't actually see the coordinated number, I think, at the rate that we may have predicted.
Now, I guess for both of you, before I move on to Wayne to speak to him, do you have an idea of a percentage maybe of your employees that live off Cape? Or if it's a large number as a result of?
It's not a large number for us. I mean, I'd say less than 20%.
Okay. So people are hanging in there.
Yes,
and hanging on.
absolutely. And, we find that people who grew up on the Cape tend to work at Cape Cod Healthcare. So we've had people that, but they've been here a long time. So it's not new people coming into the community, because it's a great place. It's people go there and they can raise their families by working in an environment like that. The other piece that you mentioned too is getting into the high schools, I think, is important, and educating them on what the opportunities are on Cape Cod. So what you can do for a career. We work with Cape Cod Community College, we work with Upper Cape Tech for their healthcare, medical type programs, so that we can pull those students in and get them into our facilities so that then they can continue the path down, as Cape Cod residents and stay here and work here.
And we see shifts, I think, sometimes in the numbers, and people will take a position and they'll say, I'm going to live in this other community for a period of time while they're working towards, moving into the community. I don't know that we've necessarily seen that number grow in a statistically significant way, but it is part of that conversation, getting established in another community and working their way towards
Sure.
living here.
I mean, I do think it's important to keep in mind that health systems and school districts off Cape are facing some of the same problems. And so if someone is forced to live off Cape and endure a commute, when there are alternatives that are much closer to where they're able to live, it's not surprising that that becomes a very tough sell when it comes time to retain those employees. So I think the oft-heard remark on Cape Cod, well, we're not the only place you can live off Cape. The bridge isn't so bad when it's not summertime. That's fine in a world where there's no competition. But off the Cape, we're facing some of the same demographic and labor force challenges that we are on Cape. And so I think the days of expecting the rest of the Commonwealth to come up with a solution have passed.
I was having a conversation with Chief Dunn this morning, and unfortunately he couldn't join us. He was called away, but he did share with me that so many of the new officers that he hires, and they're having a very difficult time keeping a full police force because of housing. And there's a 15-mile border-to-border rule, which I wasn't aware about. He explained to me that officer can live 15 miles between one border of a town and another, and he said he has several officers living in Plymouth and as far away as Middleborough. So again, I think to your point, how vested are you in the community? I think you want the people who are working in the town to be living in the town.
Well, and if you're serving the town, but the town can't make room for you, that's a signal.
It's really challenging, so. And then, of course, we're talking about the people who are now, and I know Wayne, for the Falmouth EDIC, one of the things that you folks look at is long-term, maybe economic development, and how does this whole thing tie into actually thinking about enticing other companies to move here or get other workers here?
Right. Well, you're right, Michael. I mean, as you know, the role for the EDIC is it's really the town's efforts to create and expand the business community, and that is a long-term challenge. So I would say that as we've looked at that challenge, particularly over the last couple of years, historically the EDIC has done projects. As an example of we took responsibility for renovating the Falmouth bus station. Yeah. That was a transportation issue because we recognize the importance of transportation for a successful community. So over the last several years, as this housing crisis has continued to evolve and really peak, with the pandemic, we've shifted our focus because we know that you can't create new business, you can't retain and expand existing business if you can't find the employees. And so I think our focus now is how we can be part of the solution with respect to the housing. And I think you're going to talk maybe in the next session a little bit about some of the definitions around housing, because there's a lot of different words that are used. I think this morning we tend to be focused on affordable, but I think from a EDIC standpoint, we certainly appreciate the importance of affordable, but it's really attainable housing, because it's a housing across a range of different careers and positions that we really need to make sure we're continuing to provide if we're going to have a vibrant business community.
I think that's a very important point. I mean, the word affordable sometimes triggers people.
Yes.
But, I mean, even, and you'll talk about the definitions in the future sessions, but we're talking about somewhere in the neighborhood usually of 80% of the area median income. So at the, within 20% of where about half of the workers typically find themselves on the Cape. So we're not talking about housing for indigent individuals necessarily, or public housing, but we're talking about housing that's affordable to people at a range of incomes within the workforce. So some have called it workforce housing, but for economic development, that's right. It's really the working age population that's struggling the most to find housing here, and I think that creates the kind of gaps, the longer lines at the restaurant, the greater challenges getting the healthcare services to an aging population, and of course the critical need to educate what young people you do have.
Yeah, the other point, of course, is we were talking about the population earlier, 32,000 people. There's about 35,000 summer residents, second homeowners who are here. And if you look at the tax rolls, what's really interesting is if you start looking at assessed values up to $500,000 or so, the mailing addresses are 02540, or they're local, Falmouth. When you start going up in $100,000 increments, up to $1 million and over, those tax bills are being sent to other places. I know 60% of the folks that own second homes live in the Boston area. So they're here on the weekends, they're here in the summer, the town feels full, and those people have the kind of disposable income to support our local businesses. And our local economy has really grown. I mean, it used to be we were strictly a summer economy. Tourism played such an important role. Tourism will always be an important part, but the year-round community is really here and it's to stay. That's really affecting your industry, obviously.
Yep.
Really a lot of pressure, and as well as you, on the other side. So it is kind of fascinating when we start talking about how there's only 40 houses under $1 million, and you go back to the median income. So the people that are buying these homes at these large values, are coming and they're retiring here. And I guess the question is, since we've entitled this, Why Should I Care? If you have people moving down here that are retiring later on, how invested are they really in the community? I think some are. They get involved in town meeting, they volunteer, there's a good point of that, but how do we also reach out and get those folks to understand that as they want to go to the emergency room, or they want to go to a restaurant for a meal, sometimes it's going to be challenging because the folks who are here full-time can't afford to live here anymore, so they're leaving. And you're seeing the same thing on the other side of the bridge, but...
I'm trying to remember who said it, but it was somebody wise who said, the society works best when older, I think they had said men, it must mean older folks plant trees, but they'll never see the shade generated by those trees, right? So communities work best when, there's a balance and we're supporting each other, but in a way that's sustainable. And I think when the distribution of the population and the seasonal population gets out of whack, it can become quite extreme. I mean, I think all the way down the Outer Cape and Provincetown, I think a number of years ago, the high school wasn't sufficiently populated, and so they closed off part of it, but they expanded the senior center into it, right? Which I think is a wonderful way to repurpose and reuse, a public facility, but it tells the story.
Right.
I read a statistic recently. I think everybody has been a bit awash in the housing price statistics, but I think it's important for this conversation to put it out on the table. The statistic that I happened to see was in January of 2019, so let's just call it 3 years ago, the average price, round number, for a single-family home was $400,000. In January of this year, it was $700,000 in Falmouth. I mean, when you talk about the type of jobs that we need to attract here and the type of people we want to become part of the fabric of our community, that's just an astounding, by any standard, just an astounding change in values that is going to have a very, very real effect.
Well, a huge part of the problem, or challenge at least, is how we choose to use the land that we have. The Cape obviously has some physical constraints and some environmental issues, and wastewater and freshwater can be challenges, particularly in certain areas. But if you're only going to build a single unit on a single unit of land, then you're going to limit your production. And so the resistance to multifamily housing development, I think, is a challenge. I mean, if you think, if I put one unit on a very valuable piece of land, it's going to be very expensive. So how would you, in that hot market, create a market where there would be more affordable housing without huge amounts of subsidy? You'd build it more densely.
Sure.
And so the trick is, of course, doing that in a way that's sustainable, giving those physical and environmental constraints that you're operating under. We're in an interesting time, though, where the federal and the state and local governments, and in here the commission, I suspect, are receiving substantial sums through the ARPA and other federal programs designed to help us recover from the pandemic, which they, I think, are explicitly can be used to deal with some of those infrastructure problems. So I think the decisions that local leaders here in Falmouth and elsewhere on the Cape make about how they're going to deploy those ARPA funds are going to have a lot to say about where we're headed.
I think it's just picking up on the comment that you made, Michael, it's worth giving credit to some of our town leadership, because we did pass an overlay zone at the town meeting in November,
Right.
which does allow, in certain areas of the town, which properly, as you suggested, address the environmental issues, because it's property that has access to our sewer system. But we've increased the density on a acreage basis up to a maximum of 20 units per acre, as opposed to the 4 or 5 or 6 that
That's
might have been
huge.
in some of those. So that's the first step. The heavier lift is going to work on that and having the parcels that can actually accommodate, because the challenge with, I don't want to get into the numbers too deeply, but that's one of the things that as the EDIC does, is we're trying to pay attention to some of those underlying trends. And the problem has gotten to the point where we need to find big answers. We're happy to have the small steps, but when it comes to trying to address the overall shortage in this, whether you want to call it workforce housing or attainable housing, there needs to be some, sizable, not huge, not out of scale, but it needs to be done. And I think this first step that the planning board and then town meeting took is a really very constructive towards what you were, making a reference.
And that's excellent news.
And what's very interesting about that article, which I thought was great, sometimes the conversation goes between the environmental issue and the housing issue. And sometimes it can be very, very much like heads coming together. That particular article with the overlay district was great because there was an amendment on the floor of town meeting to cut that overlay district down, because one part of it would impact environmental issues more, at least in this person's eyes. And really, it was a good compromise, I think. So the overlay district came in place. Let's see what happens if people take advantage of it, and then maybe people can see the success of that. It's been very confusing to me, growing up in Providence. When I got out of college, my first home was a two-family home, because I was scared to death to buy a house. And it was an amazing investment, because I owned that home for over 20 years. Ended up paying it off. I had my tenant was with me. And then I remember moving here, and there's no two-family homes or anything, no apartments, the lack of apartments, and those are things I think that could really impact very positively both the healthcare industry and the education industry, where people who are starting out can a path to ownership.
Well, the lack of a vibrant rental market
Right.
that's year-round is a big problem.
Yeah.
Because about 2/3 of U.S. households own a home, but the rest don't, right? And so if someone's coming here from elsewhere, they're trying out a new employer, they're living in a new community, the price to entry is very high, and sometimes people can afford payments, but not necessarily the down payment, say. So even at market rates, rentals are hard to come by, and it's clear that if I had an extra housing unit on the Cape, Airbnb seems a very compelling way to maximize my income, and there's nothing wrong with that for visitors. But again, I think it further puts downward pressure on the available units for people who are looking for a year-round option.
Yeah, I think that just happens too often. People will take that summer month, rent it out by the week, and make money, and a lot of those houses sit empty. Whereas you could put a young teacher or a young CNA or somebody in that, housing unit, and they can work and save money and then move into something else. Back to kind of planting the tree.
Yes.
And having this equilibrium.
We had a group, at our last EDIC board meeting, we had a group of 4 young women from the Woods Hole community, from the scientific community, who purposely came to our meeting and spoke in the public comment section about the challenges that they have in housing. I think they recognized that it was an area that the EDIC was focused on, and they wanted to make sure that their voices were heard, because they told some of the same type of stories. It's a combination of price and availability. And I don't need to tell the folks here who have significant staffs that they're trying to find housing for, but it was really impressive to listen to them articulate the challenges that they've got. These are bright young women who are, in the midst of securing significant higher education degrees, and it's a real challenge.
Yeah.
I mean, over time, this will sort itself out, because affordability is about not just price, but about income. And so I'm sure the employers on the panel and the other members of the chamber can tell you that the wage that you have to pay in order to get somebody to yes is rising.
Well, that's a huge problem, and we get that all the time from the chamber, because of course we're dealing with existing businesses right now. People are saying, well, we're going to have to charge $30 for a hamburger if we have to charge somebody in the kitchen X amount, because that's what they have to pay to go to rent a place, if they can even find a place. And it just becomes more and more expensive to run a business, and the businesses can't find people to work.
Even at the higher wages.
Yep.
Several of the hotels last year ended up giving up rooms that they could otherwise rent to house their employees. So that was income that they missed out on, just in order to be able to operate. And
Well, and in season, a night in one of those rooms is not a small sacrifice, right? That's big money.
yeah, big money. And we're seeing that more and more. We're having a conversation with Falmouth Public Beaches last week, and they're having difficulty hiring lifeguards. There aren't as many young people living here, and, So, 21 years you've been here, in the schools and all, and you've seen this go, and it must somehow concern you and scare you a little bit. Also being a mother and having kids, and,
Yeah. It's interesting, because I'm glad you reframed that, because I'm thinking about it certainly from my professional perspective in my role, but you and I often talk about our children.
Yeah.
And it changes the narrative that you have with your children about how you see them staying here. I have 2 children. One's closer to moving into college, and that's the conversation we're now starting to have, is picking a college and thinking about loans and things like that, but thinking about what's your ultimate goal, and is it to come back here? Because we have to balance that early and think about that. But I do think about when I came into Falmouth in the fall of 2001, there were nearly 60 people hired at that time. That was one of the first big waves of retirements that had moved through our district in some time. And I think about the people I started with, and some are still here, and some have had to make choices to move into different places in the Commonwealth or in the country. And some of that's driven for a certain personal circumstance, but some of it is driven around where they could find a place to really set up their roots, and part of that was around, I like that, the attainable housing,
Sure.
right? The opportunities that are there for them. And so kind of seeing that, and seeing then this sort of set of circumstances now kind of wrap around, it increases the level of alarm.
Yeah, really, to the point that, I know I have 2 daughters who are away at college, and they're not moving back to Falmouth. Really challenging. In fact, one of my daughters said to me, Dad, if you get roommates, it's cheaper to live in Boston. I don't know how much space they're going to get. The big issue is, of course, they can't find a place to rent here anyway, but it's really very challenging. And,
Yeah. But it's been an issue for years, right? It's not something new. The cost and the availability of housing has been an issue, and it's just grown, right? So we knew this was coming, and as we run out of land and the ability to build, then we have less and less opportunity there. So, I mean, it's not like it's just brand new. It's been here for a long time. We go through it every summer with our travelers, trying to find them housing,
Yes.
and each year, it gets progressively worse. You know, you can make in a week what a 1-month rent would be.
Right.
You know, so and I can't blame people either, right, for wanting to make the money during the summer and be able to do that, but at the same token, it's really hard. And we have a lot of people who get a winter rental, and then they're scrambling to try and find something for the summer.
Yes.
So the rental environment is not stable for people to be able to have something that they can rely on.
I remember, we moved down here, I think it was 2005. My wife had been here since 1988, and then in the summers before that. And she had a college friend who grew up down Cape, but was living on the Vineyard. So when we moved here, I think it was like 2005. And I remember, to your point, she was living in a house during the off-season, but she had to vacate in the summer.
Right.
And she used to sleep in a tent in the summer and take showers in her health club. And that was back in '05. And I remember saying to myself, oh my God, how can that be? Well, that's happening here now. Fast forward.
Yeah.
And, you know,
I think
how do we...
technically, we call that homelessness, right?
We do. And, you know, it's, you know, how can we as a town take this example that's happened on Nantucket, on the Vineyard, we're right on it now, and how can we either reverse it or slow it down? I know you said, you know, it'll take care of itself, and you're right, all
No,
cycles
I mean,
do.
Extremely, and
in an
that would be an extreme
Yeah, and
way
I'm
to do it.
certainly, and I'm not implying that you're saying, oh, it's gonna be all set, because I think unfortunately, a lot of people's attitude is like, well, it is what it is, and whatever's gonna happen is gonna happen, and, you know, it's easy to say that if you're not as invested, or you've got what you want, but
Well, I mean, but it's one thing to wait in line for someone to scoop your ice cream. It's another thing to wait in line at the hospital.
Right.
Right?
Right.
right?
So,
And
so
we have the
stakes
busiest ER in the state during the summer. So,
Absolutely. And also to pump up Falmouth Public Schools a little bit too, one of the best performing schools on the Cape. We have more kids coming into the district because of school choice. So here you go, you have this vibrant school department, the school system that has really performed for years. And how does that, you know, that downward trend affect funding, teachers, and what does that do to the overall education that's going to be provided for, you know, the remaining population that's here, until the whole community comes together and says, wait, you know, we have to do something about this as a community.
I think that's what's, might need to be what's different now. I think as was said, this is not a new problem. It's clearly exacerbated for the reasons that we've touched on. It's reached the point where there's going to have to be some new approaches. People are going to be open to some new ideas that are going to take all parts of the community to put their shoulder behind. I mean, the business community, which you're as close to as anybody, is going to have to be supportive of the fact that we need more density in certain areas. You know, there's just, it's going to require fresh ideas. It's going to require that the town look at how they might fund affordable housing differently. I mean, we were fortunate. I'm active on the Affordable Housing Committee, and we were an advocate for some funding out of the town's general fund at the last town meeting. And fortunately, in part because of some of the public funding that had flowed from the federal government, the town was able to make a significant contribution, the largest contribution that's ever made it to the Falmouth Affordable Housing Fund. It was a $4 million contribution, which is wonderful. That probably, if you dive deeper into the statistics and what is really needed from a housing production standpoint, that's probably the equivalent of about 1 year's worth of subsidy in order to advance the production levels that we need. So this is a problem that requires sustainable solutions. And sustainable solutions require that everybody participate. The business community participates, the employers participate, the town itself, the not-for-profits. Everybody's got to kind of come together to help find the solutions if it's going to really move the needle, you know.
And the Cape's not alone. Falmouth's not alone. This is a statewide problem. last year, demographically, the population has been growing in Massachusetts, but largely due to international immigration, which has been reduced lately due to the pandemic and some federal policy. But last year, the last recorded year, I think it was 2020, more deaths than births in Massachusetts, right? Which is, we could talk about demographics for a long time, I won't. But, that's the wrong way to go,
Yeah,
right? And,
clearly.
And so I think in many respects, Cape Cod is the canary in the coal mine, right? And if we're not making it possible for younger families to make a life for themselves here in Massachusetts, and that has to involve a reasonable place to live, then, the kinds of struggles that we're talking about here on Cape Cod will be more and more of the norm statewide, and it's just simply not sustainable.
And it's such a great place to raise kids. It's a safe
everyone
community,
loves it
you
here.
know, and we've got great schools. It's, but you just can't get here.
I mean, it's amazing. We're blessed to live here. And
Yes.
I pinch myself every day. Wow. And, live and work in your community. But again, that's not happening for everybody. And the leadership part is really what comes into play is, the town, coming together and I think collaborating. Collaboration is really important and bringing people together. The small businesses, the schools, healthcare, public safety, to really come up with these plans. I know zoning's a big issue.
Oh, yes.
And I know that's something we're going to talk about specifically on our third section, but, just kind of overview-wise, when we look at zoning and where we're at right now, I mean, when you look at Falmouth, how many housing units can you really add now anyway? You're talking hundreds, not thousands, based on what the zoning is. And, back to your point, $4 million is a substantial amount of money, and that helps, but we need to be producing so many more units, and density is really the only answer.
Yeah, I mean, there's no silver bullet here. This isn't something that can be addressed overnight, but I think there have been some examples, and it sounds like Falmouth is one, where communities can be opportunistic, where they can see, I think in some communities, I'm thinking about Provincetown, they've identified town-owned land or repurposed town utilized land for this purpose in ways that are environmentally sustainable. But you're right, it's a couple of dozen units here, it's a couple of dozen units there. But and then I think when these when our current residents begin to turn over their property, their properties are inherited, there may be ways that during that transfer process, there can be policies that would help facilitate a broader, more sustainable community development here on Cape Cod and in Falmouth in particular. These are politically touchy things.
Of course they are, but we're just having a conversation because the whole point of this is to get everybody to start thinking about this, how we're all basically in the same stew cooking together here. And how do we get people to really understand the significance of this and how it's impacting the entire community? And, if I'm living in my big house and I'm very comfortable and I feel good, I can go downtown, there's great boutiques, great restaurants, and it's all wonderful, I may not really think about it. But when I have to wait in line at the emergency room or I have to wait
Luxury
in line.
resort is not a community.
Luxury resort is not a community, right. And so,
Nothing wrong with luxury resorts.
No,
but-
there is
But
not.
they're not the same thing as a community.
right, so, and again, though, I think that, when we talk about this, or when it's talked about, a lot of times it's talked in political terms, or it's talked in like zoning terms, or whatever. It's not talked in social community terms, how, I think the mark of any society, any community is that there's equilibrium. You have people living within the community at all different income levels, doing all different kinds of jobs, Steve Abbott, former CEO of Cape Cod Healthcare, once told me, it was one of the greatest quotes I ever heard, he said to me, Michael, there is honor in all work. And he really truly believed that.
Yeah.
And whatever you choose to do, I tell my kids, and I'm sure you're telling your kids, aim for happiness and be happy in your life. Now, we could do that back in our day because everybody got out of college and made $300 a week, and that was enough to live. But today, it's not quite so simple to aim for happiness because you might not be able to afford in that place you want to be happy in. And it's really compounded things. And I think, it's just trying to get everybody to understand and come together. A call to action is really what we're trying to do here. And not pointing fingers And not saying this group could do better or, but trying to get people together to have this conversation. This is a wonderful conversation we're having, but it'd be nice if the entire community was having that conversation. And, really coming together in a way that we would come back to a point where it was a town where you had, kids in neighborhoods and it wasn't just all, becoming more of a retirement community, so.
Yeah, I mean, it's not an easy thing. It didn't take, it took years and years to get to this point.
Right.
And it'll take years and years to recover, but it's really about making room for our children.
Yes.
But it's going to take some fresh ideas. It's going to take a different perspective, because as you said, there is no silver bullet to it. The problem is too long in coming, and there's some structural issues that we can't change. But that doesn't mean that as a community we can't come together and find some alternatives that will really address the most unique needs.
And your point, I think, is well taken, that it's really all about education. And our role as a Chamber of Commerce, back to the business community, is such that, yes, we need to educate, have more of these sessions, and talk to business owners and people who are members to understand, if they don't already understand, that, what's good for the community is good for business. If we don't solve this, we're going to have widespread failure of business.
Right.
I mean, I can't tell you how many businesses we've talked to that, tell us, they just get by and make a living. And it's more and more challenging because, obviously everything else that keeps going up, the costs of products and services, et cetera. But then when you start throwing in the housing costs of employees and when you have to pay people more, at what point does somebody say, I got to move. I can't run my little business here anymore. And then you start having empty storefronts. And then there's nowhere for the wealthy retirement community to go and spend that disposable income.
And all the hard work over the years of trying to create a year-round economy on Cape Cod
Right.
is undermined.
Yeah. I mean, we have a serious shortage of hotel rooms. I mean, we continue every year to lose hotel rooms in Falmouth. So it becomes less and less, the Airbnb has taken a lot of that.
Picking it up.
Yeah, has
Right.
really taken a lot of that. But then you wonder, how challenging it is for an operator to run a hotel or a motel, and then, have to keep things fresh and keep things going. And you're right, when you come into a resort community, it's nice to have a resort community, but now we're not that anymore. And, I hear the stories. I wasn't here for that. I'd like to say I'm too young for this, but they used to talk about boarding houses in Falmouth. The people would come down for the summers, and there would be boarding houses that people would live in and work for the summers.
I mean, it must have been 10 or 15 years ago, but I think I was in Yarmouth, and there was an argument going on about replacing some of the motels along Route 28, I believe it is, the main drag. And the resistance to upgrading those motels was from local employers who said, well, where are my people going to live this summer if they can't rent rooms in these hotels
Yeah.
or these motels that the visitors don't want any part of anymore, but they're essentially have been the emergency alternative of last resort for the employers who are hiring people seasonally to provide services to those same visitors.
And we've had the same thing here in Falmouth. A couple of our larger properties have, over the years prior to this huge up, seeing it coming, as you alluded to, it's been happening for a while, have bought those kind of motels in Onset and then further down Cape, and that's where they bus their employees to. But even now, it's too expensive for that, for that to happen. And
Well,
really
the
challenging.
alternative uses for those properties, which are usually in very appealing places, are compelling.
Sure.
Yeah.
The
The
other
land
thing,
is worth a
the
lot.
other thing too, we had talked about briefly before we came in here was the accessory dwelling bylaw that passed. And, great idea, really expensive though, and haven't seen a lot of action on that. You'd think that that was a great alternative. It was thinking outside of the box, but that's really challenging too. You're not finding many people taking advantage of that. And I'm curious,
It may still be early. I haven't been closely paying attention to the local change. I mean, I think as people age, for all kinds of good reasons, I think they want to try to age in place as much as they can.
Sure.
But many of us, when we get to a certain age, need support. So the idea of staying in place, and then maybe you have a family member or someone else who could come also live in your unit, is very appealing. But I'm not sure what would be slowing that down. I know
I think
previously
the,
the cost of
yeah.
conversion currently is pretty high, given the cost of construction materials and labor.
And I'm certainly not an expert on it, but I think I've picked up on a couple of things. First of all, it's a little bit cumbersome for people to understand the regulations and the zoning around it. I think the planning boards looking at that a little more closely to see if they can do some things to streamline it, which is great. And then I think you're right, that the reality, we all know the reality of trying to find a contractor these days. And when you're talking about an expansion of an existing house with an accessory dwelling unit, that's a relatively modest kind of project. And I think it's probably a combination of cost and availability of labor.
Makes sense.
Right? It's coming back to full circle to have an impact on that. I think that's another example of a long-term change that hopefully over time will add, at the margin at least, some affordable units, but probably doesn't ultimately move the needle significantly.
But to your
it'd be nice
point,
to have.
what's nice about that is, people did start thinking differently.
Right.
For town meeting to come together and pass that bylaw, getting people, citizens to come together and actually say, wow, this is a pretty good idea, let's go with it. That's the great first step.
That's
And
what
then-
we need.
yeah.
And another good example, I think, that picks up on some of the comments is at the town meeting, there's this, the short-term rentals is a very real issue, and it has an impact on the rental housing. The community got behind a community impact fee, which was something that was available to any town in Falmouth, but not many have elected to use it, and the town meeting voted for that. So if you own multiple, not just one, so if you have your home and you're able to take advantage of an Airbnb situation, that's not an impact. But if you string together multiple Airbnb units, there now is a very modest fee that's associated with your rentals there. Again, trying to then put those monies back into the Falmouth Affordable Housing Fund so that it can have funds to potentially add to the development of new units. So I think that was a creative way to try to start to think about what it is that's really at the heart of some of the problems that we're having with generating units.
And that's just good policy, right?
Good
I mean, there are
policy,
these externalities or these problems that are created by this use of land, and you can recover some of that. I mean, hotels and motels, I suspect in most communities on the Cape have to pay the local, they administer local fees or taxes
Yes.
for each of
Yeah,
those.
yeah.
So if there's going to be accommodations for visitors at scale, like you said, more than one unit is a business, then they should pay their fair share just like everyone else.
And the reality is it doesn't seem to be tamping the demand down, right? I mean, the cost gets passed along to the user, and
The
there seems
visitors
to
do
still
seem
be.
to have a high tolerance for price increases.
Yeah.
When you're interviewing people, both at Cape Cod Healthcare and for Falmouth Public Schools, is that like one of the first questions that come up? How many people are prepared to talk about housing and the cost of housing?
I think it comes up, for those who don't live on the Cape, it certainly comes up as one of the first questions about, how do I secure housing? If I'm relocating here, who can assist me with finding something? We get that, especially with the summer staff coming in, we keep a list. I mean, as simple as that is, we pulse out to our employees and say, hey, if you have a room, if you have anything, give us your information, and then we keep a list, and, we go back to that list all the time and try to make that connection for people. But yeah, it is, if people are not located on the Cape, then it's certainly right on front of mind.
I see.
It doesn't tend to come up, I think, for us in initial interviews. And then as we get closer to the offer of employment, that's definitely something our team and our human resources department fields. I know that as you enter our administration building, there's a bulletin board on the side, and that's usually where we make some of our initial contacts and exchange information. But even the volume of those, right? From what used to be there, it would be handwritten notes and cards. It's down to a few. So our HR team is definitely very active in trying to make connections and matches where they know there's an available opportunity.
Actually helping people find places to live.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I mean, I know the local churches are doing that, and we get, it seems like it's almost daily we get somebody that comes into the chamber saying, hey, I need a place for the summer, we'll have J1 workers show up, and it's like, wait a minute, should have been taken care of for you, but we refer the best we can to, we try to keep a list, but, it used to be larger, actually. Going back several years, there were people, citizens that would come to the chamber and say, we have a room for the summer and all, but less and less of that. In fact, I have two acquaintances, friends of ours.
Oh, you mean to help find tenants?
Yes.
Rather than the
Yeah,
other way around?
Yeah, to help find tenants. And we have two couples, friends of ours, who were renting by choice, because some people want to rent. They don't want to, who are now not homeless yet, but being told that, hey, we're going to sell the property, so that's not going to work anymore because we want to cash out. But, I thought one interesting thing I wanted to get back to, just to get your overall thought, because you brought something up, and I didn't really think about this until you actually talked about it. You talked about the folks aging out and people inheriting these properties. So a lot of times we see what ends up happening with that is multiple family members inherit one property who don't live near here, and the thing they do is they sell the property. So will that not only perpetuate what's going on, or do you think there's some opportunity maybe with that?
Well, so the question of what those second homeowners are going to do with those second homes is a big one. And I know a few years ago, maybe many years ago now, I'm aging, the commission commissioned a survey of those homeowners. And a very high percentage of them, as I recall, said that they wanted to retire to the second homes.
Okay.
Now, for the folks that are already retired and living here.
And that's who I mean, yes.
Right. I mean, I think I guess it depends on your family, right? So I have three brothers, so
Sure.
would we split the house? Would we decide we were going to visit it once a year? Or would we look at the seven-figure opportunity and divest ourselves of it? I mean, I think a good portion of those homes may well be sold. It really depends. I mean, some of these homes run in these families for many, many generations, and there's a great sentimental attachment to
Certainly.
the family Cape House.
The Cape House, of course.
Right,
yes.
right.
Great movie.
And Down the Cape. Oh, I haven't seen the movie. I just grew up in Massachusetts, so I know that the Cape House was the dream of all of us. It's only attained by some. So yeah, I mean, I think you can see that those homes turning over, and I suspect that you already see when those homes turning over, people coming and let's call it extensively renovating them.
Yes. So I don't know.
Maybe
is there
even knocking them down and building
opportunities,
brand new homes.
incentives in the future to do something? I don't know.
Yeah.
So it's just interesting when
The
you talk
values
about,
are very, very high.
They
So yeah, the trick is how do you recapture some of the community costs that are incurred when these sorts of things happen? Not to punish people who have been successful, but rather to acknowledge that these choices have impacts on the community.
Sure. Interesting. So time will tell.
Yeah, I mean, I would guess that a lot of them will be sold.
Yeah. And so, what does that really do long term? Is that to perpetuate our problem?
I mean, I do think a lot of those homeowners, at least historically, live in Massachusetts, and so
Yes.
for extended families that have access, that can imagine driving here from some other part of the state, there may be some desire to hang on to it. But it depends on your household, right? You sit down with your siblings, and sometimes selling and splitting the money is the smartest thing to do.
And it certainly doesn't help as we think about the inventory of affordable housing, but the added dynamic you have is now the remote work and the ability for people to come to the Cape, and it's no longer the second home, depending upon the family dynamics, but it's the primary residence. And I think the Cape Cod Commission just completed a fairly extensive study of some surveying around the pandemic dynamics and remote work. And I'm certainly not prepared to quote the results, but it was rather interesting.
There's no question that the rise of remote work is having an impact on housing markets. I'm in New Bedford, which is not known as the hotbed of real estate price appreciation, and my home has appreciated dramatically in value the last few years. Not quite like if it were on the Cape, but but respectable nonetheless. And so I do think it is changing the choices that people are making about where they want to live, especially for folks who are in semi-professional positions where some remote work is possible. Getting from here to Boston on a daily basis would be quite onerous, particularly during certain seasons of the year. But if you only had to do it once or twice a week, it might not be.
Right.
You might say maybe my summer house should be my house, and maybe my
Sure.
my suburban Boston home should be.
Right.
liquidated or.
But you know, a rising tide, right, raises all ships. So to your point with New Bedford, so now that we're kind of where we're at here, now you go off Cape, you get into Wareham or whatever, and then Marion and Mattapoisett, and by the time you get out there, everything gets, you know, so at what point does it stop and then everything else starts going up to ridiculousness?
Right, well, you're right. So I mean, in a world where you have more options about where to live while maintaining your current job arrangement, it does put a number of regions and communities in play that haven't been there historically. And so people who might really love it here and live where they live solely because they need to stay close to work, if they have an alternative, I can easily imagine them, at least initially, saying, I'd be better off on the Cape.
Yeah.
And it changes who our competitors are.
Oh, I bet.
Right, so historically, we've had to go with the local southeastern Mass hospitals to compete against for talent. But now, you know, with people being able to be remote for positions in like IT and finance and those types of things, we've done remote and hybrid there, but we're looking at paying at the same rates as Boston, right? So that's changed dramatically for us just because of the pandemic.
I heard a statistic recently that, I think I'm going to get this right, the average median income on the Cape a year plus ago, so let's call it 2020, was essentially $90,000. The numbers just came in for 21, and it was $115,000. And it's really the result of these people who are now able to work remote and claim the Cape as their residence, because it's not that the, you know, kind of the backbone of the economy that we're talking about that we need in terms of service workers and nurses and teachers has seen that kind of an increase. What's happened is it's the influx of technology workers and some of those folks who are now staying on the Cape, and this wasn't a Falmouth-specific statistic, but I mean, I think I'm sure it holds true for here as well. But so all of a sudden, and those average median income numbers have jumped dramatically. I mean, that increase from $90,000 to $115,000.
Sure.
And it has a whole set of ramifications, frankly, in the affordable housing space, which we won't go into. But it's a pretty dramatic statistic.
Well, sure, if you're tying affordability into medium income, right? So there you go. It does have an impact. So again, new ideas, thinking out of the box. Maybe you need to think about, or we need to think about, you know, what are the terms for somebody to be able to
Well, and we
move
get,
into?
I mean, and a lot of those thresholds are set at the state and federal level by these housing programs, but inequality is an issue. I mean, we use the median incomes because we figure, well, it's the middle of the distribution, right? So half above and half below, and, you know, it all sort of sorts itself out, but it doesn't when there's a lot of people who are very clustered at the middle and a bunch at the high end and a very large number at the low end. So I suspect what you're thinking is that as that median income goes up, then the threshold to be eligible for affordable housing goes up too, and then and then the folks who are at the lowest end of the income spectrum find themselves, you know, further disadvantaged.
Well, there's more people now who will be competing for fewer units. I mean, for the same units in the
And
best case.
being able to pay more.
And be able to pay more. But remember, at the same time that dynamic, which again is, I think, has some unique characteristics to the statistic, you've got increasing prices and increasing interest rates, which means increasing mortgage rates.
right.
So you've seen housing prices increase to this notion, you know, a $700,000, which, oh, by the way, that means your down payment has also just dramatically
yes.
increased. So the affordability is, it hits you in a number of different
Yes.
ways.
Now, the good news is that the remote IT worker doesn't have to find a housing unit here, right?
Yeah.
But
that's not
we've
what
not
we're-
figured out remote nursing yet.
No, we
Or
can't
remote
do that.
teaching, right? I mean, how's that going to affect schools?
And even just thinking about it without the perspective of the employees, I'm thinking about just from the perspective of the families, right? The children that we
Right.
serve. And so you look at, you know, we've touched on a number of pieces from, you know, the shift from winter rentals to the impact of the summer. That's a mobility for our students, right? That's multiple moves within a year, because that's still carrying into the beginning of our school year, then it's affecting them again. And you think about, you know, if you really want the children who are here and the families who are here to be invested and to stay, you know, you've got to give them that consistency, you know, and that's going to serve all of us.
Well, I think this is all, I mean, housing is at the center of a whole host of challenges
Absolutely.
we have in the Northeast in particular, but in Massachusetts and Cape Cod, that is about supporting families, right? And so housing particularly for households with school-age kids, is there, and I'm sure we could have a similar conversation about childcare, right, which I think can be and has been, a kind of a pricing obstacle to labor force participation for women in particular, but not exclusively, as they look at the wages and they look at the cost of, taking care of their families and say, it's just simply not worth it. So the more we can do to support our families, I mean, if we're committed to the future, I mean, this seems very banal, right?
No, not at all. That's the point, and you're absolutely right. and it's all
Children
about
are the future.
They
I'm not
are,
the
and
first
it's-
person to make that
You're right.
observation, but it's nevertheless true.
That is the point, and that is really the purpose of coming together to discuss this with people outside on the television audience to really understand that. Because I'm not convinced that everybody really understands the severity of the problem. People read about it, and it's easy to say, well, that's not affecting me, or that's not Falmouth, and I don't think people really do understand the impact long-term in this big picture of, what we want our town. The thing is, we need to look ahead 20 years. What do we want our town to look like 20 years from now?
Well, I mean, I can't help but look in the camera and say, if you're complaining about the quality of service, right?
Right?
What
I
you're
know.
complaining about is a lack of places for people who would provide you with that service to live, among other things.
And it's not, it's absolutely that, and that's how it becomes very, very visceral. But it's a fabric of the community. When you have the opportunity to walk down the street and bump into the fireman or the teacher or the nurse that you've gotten to know or you see, it's really this fork. I don't want to be too dramatic about it, but there is a potentially a fork, whereas the term was used about it becoming a resort community earlier. But that's really what happens when you don't allow there to be the opportunity for people who work here to live here.
And I've said on other occasions that the Cape is running an experiment in whether or not you can have a society without children in it, and that the jury's still out, but that I'm very skeptical.
Yeah, I mean, back to conversation with Chief Dunn, he, continually talks about how he'll have officers that will come after a couple of years, after the money is invested in sending them to academy and everything, say, I just can't afford to live here. I can't afford to live on that salary, and I'm going to go and not just move to another department. Leave law enforcement. These are men and women who have wanted to be in law enforcement, valuable members of our society that are leaving because, they've just become frustrated with being unable to find a place to raise a family.
Well, and these frontline positions and teachers and healthcare professionals are certainly part of that mix. The burnout, especially over the last couple of years, I can't imagine what it's been for you both. I know what we dealt with at the university during all of the displacement. It's been very, very, very demanding, and so to confront these challenges on top of those, I think, has led to people, voting with their feet in many cases.
And they have options.
They do.
They have options.
Yeah,
It is very beautiful here, but it isn't the only place to live.
Right.
very true. So, great conversation. Thought it was wonderful. I'd like to wrap it up by asking you each, optimistic? What do you think? What do you think? What do you think the future will bring? You think we can make this happen and get the community to come together and at least getting the team to run down the field in the same direction?
I'll take that on first. I mean, I think what you said is really important, and that is that this is a community-wide challenge, and it's only going to be solved by the community. And I'm optimistic. I'm not a long-term Falmouth person, but I've been here long enough to see. I've always been impressed the way that this community does seem to come together around a range of issues, not this specifically. And so I have a positive outlook on it, Michael. I think that we need to remember that this is not only a Falmouth problem. This is a problem that is literally almost national. I mean, there's very few communities that aren't facing some of the same things. And I think if we can come together as a community and the different types of leadership that can be shown and keep our eyes open to some of the things that other people are doing, that's how, to me, it seems like what can be a rather daunting set of issues, we might just pick up a kernel here and a kernel there, and I think then this community does have the ability to kind of piece maybe some of those disparate pieces together in a unique way to serve our challenges.
Wonderful.
I'm equally optimistic, and just as you've invited us here to share our voices, I think knowing who our students are and the teachers really as the champion of the story over the past few years, and still bringing forward students' creativity, flexibility in thinking, resilience, bringing their voice into some of that creative problem solving and having them be able to articulate sort of the vision that they have. Because if we're looking at that 20-year picture, you know, they could very well be the ones sitting in our seats if we revisit this conversation and we're assessing outcomes. So just including their voice, I think, helps take that optimism to a new level.
Wonderful.
I agree. I'm optimistic. I mean, the Cape is a community, and it's always worked as a community, and I think we'll all pull together and we'll figure this out. But I also think that the children are where we need to focus, and engaging them in the community and how they can get employment here and advance their careers in this community is going to be part of the puzzle.
I mean, the challenges are profound, but the facts are stubborn. And I think no choice, I like to say, often makes things easier. But I agree that this is a regional, a state, and a national problem. It sounds like the community leaders in Falmouth and the members of the town meeting as well, you know, have had a more insightful, longer-term perspective so far, as reflected in some of the meaningful policy changes that have taken place here. So I'm optimistic, but it's not going to happen overnight, and it's not going to happen without a lot of hard work.
Sure. I also remain optimistic. I agree. I think Falmouth is a very special place, and I'm very proud to call it my adopted home. And I really do believe, as Wayne said, the community comes together on a number of issues, and I think the community really supports the hospital, schools, fire and safety, and I think together we can, we can work together. But again, collaborating, and I'm hopeful and optimistic, and we'll see. This is great. Our first session. I want to thank the viewers from home for joining us. We're going to be continuing with 2 more sessions. The next session, we're going to be meeting with leaders who are working on housing from a variety of agencies, which will be very interesting. So this first section, we really want to talk about big picture and how it's impacting some of the major stakeholders in the community. The next section, we're going to be talking about boots on the ground, what's really happening for housing, and we're going to, it's going to be between talking a little bit about myths and facts, and what is affordable housing, what is Section 8 housing, what is a 40B, and kind of getting into that. And our third section is going to be delving into some of the different ideas of think, what other communities might be doing, what has been successful in certain places, and what might be. So I'd like to thank our panelists. Dr. Michael Goodman for being here. Michelle Scarbeck, thank you so much. Dr. Tellier, always a pleasure. Wayne Lingenfelter, thank you so much. And I want to thank the Cooperative Bank of Cape Cod and FCTV for helping to make this possible. And from the Falmouth Chamber of Commerce, I'm Michael Kasparian. Thank you very much.